For staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, after struggling through the early years of the pandemic to get enough COVID-19 vaccinations, Africa's first factory to produce the doses on the continent says it may have to stop because it hasn't had enough orders. Also, a former top Congolese police officer is given a death sentence over the killing of an activist 12 years ago. Floribert Chebeya's body was found in his car in Kinshasa after being summoned to a meeting with the Inspector General and going to police headquarters. And Mali's sanctioned, but Senegal loses out. The economic interdependence between the neighbours has left Senegalese traders struggling to cope with the knock-on effects of sanctions imposed on Bamako's ruling junta back in January. The first facilities to manufacture COVID-19 vaccines in Africa has warned that it might have to stop production because it hasn't received enough orders. South Africa's Aspen Pharmacare's shifted its production to produce more than 200 million doses of Johnson & Johnson vaccines in a move that had been seen as a game changer for the continent as it struggled to source shots. But Johnson & Johnson didn't order enough doses from Aspen, and it's now considering returning to the production of anaesthetics. South Africa's president called on agencies providing vaccines for Africa to buy more made on the continent. Nadine Thera joins us now with more from Cape Town. Nadine, so it's a pretty disappointing development considering the efforts to up African vaccine manufacturing capacity that we've seen throughout the pandemic. So what went wrong?
So the plant says isn't getting any orders at all because there's an oversupply of vaccines, it seems in Africa at least, because Africa receives 2/3 of its vaccines through the COVAX sharing program, and COVAX says it has an oversupply of vaccines. And President Cyril Ramaphosa from South Africa has criticized those who purchased and procured vaccines for Africa for not supporting African manufacturers or the Aspen plant specifically. But COVAX, their vaccine partner, says they already had a contract with Johnson & Johnson and that it's not in their hands where that pharmaceutical company decides to produce those vaccines. And here in South Africa, there's certainly, the government has said there's more than enough vaccines for the entire population. But more than 7 million doses of expired vaccine is actually going to be destroyed by July, most probably, if the vaccination uptake doesn't increase, because only 44% of South Africans are vaccinated, and the country has been the worst affected on the continent, and yet there's great vaccine hesitancy. So there's an under-demand and an oversupply of vaccines here at the moment.
And so why is there still such a big problem when it comes to vaccine hesitancy in South Africa, at least?
Well, some critics blame African governments for failing to establish successful vaccination communication campaigns. South Africa had such a success with HIV. The vaccination campaigns for COVID doesn't seem to have really impacted people or hit home. And some experts cite it's because people don't trust the government. They just don't trust the government because of the corruption that took place in the COVID-19 personal protective equipment procurement, and at the same time they're being bombarded with misinformation and conspiracy theories on the internet. So some government officials used the pandemic as a money-making scheme, and that really made people not trust them. And there's also a misconception that previous infection makes you immune against the virus, and it's not true because the vaccine protects much better against severe disease.
And what do Aspen's difficulties mean more widely in terms of the continent's ambition to reduce its dependence on imported vaccines?
So Africa, the Union planned to produce 60% of all vaccines on the continent by 2040 because African countries really struggled to procure vaccines last year when most of Europe was already vaccinated, and they want to increase local manufacturing. But this Aspen plant's failure means that the other vaccine makers are not going to be successful either. And there are other makers. Biotech is producing vaccines in South Africa later this year. And now some experts say that this means that global health security is at risk, because with the next pandemic, Africa will be last in line again when it comes to vaccines if we don't start producing them locally on this continent.
Thanks very much, Nadine Theron, there speaking to us from Cape Town. Now, Congolese military court sentenced a high-ranking police officer to death for the 2010 killings of human rights activist Floribert Chebeya. Colonel Christian Kenga was found guilty of murder, desertion and misappropriation of weapons and ammunition. He was the commander of the Simba battalion responsible for Chebeya's assassination. Clément Bonero with more.
The killing of Floribert Chebeya and his driver Fidel Bazana in June 2010 sparked widespread outrage both nationally and internationally. Chebeya was the head of one of the most respected human rights organizations in DR Congo, Voice of the Voiceless. As a fierce critic of the government, he'd received regular death threats. His body was found in his car on the outskirts of Kinshasa after he was summoned to the police headquarters to meet the then head of the National Police Force, General John Numbi. 4 policemen were initially sentenced to death in 2011, but the trial reopened last September after new witness testimonies emerged. On Wednesday, the court named Colonel Kenga as the coordinator of the operation and sentenced him to death. It's worth noting, though, that the death penalty is no longer applied in DR Congo. Those found guilty usually serve life sentences instead. Another policeman, Deputy Commissioner Jacques Mugabo, was handed a 12-year jail term. Mugabo had confessed to strangling Chebeya, but in sentencing, the court took his cooperation with authorities into consideration. Meanwhile, Police Commissioner Paul Mulambwe, who was a key witness in the trial, was acquitted. Last but not least, General Numbi, who's considered to be the mastermind behind Chebeya's murder, is yet to face trial. He's reportedly fled the country, and his current whereabouts are unknown.
Well, Tanzanians may see some relief from soaring prices at the pump after the government pledged about 41 million euros worth of subsidies this week. The measure should take effect from the start of next month. Kamina Dlek with more.
In response to soaring prices in Tanzania, the government has implemented several measures, including a fuel subsidy. Dodoma also wants to make lemons into lemonade. It plans to cash in on those rising prices by boosting its own oil and gas sector.
We have defined our management strategy for our national petroleum reserves, and the amendments to the law are complete. We will implement oil subsidies in the near future, and we will also begin on building oil export facilities.
One of the projects that could benefit is the construction of an onshore LNG plant in the southeastern town of Lindi. After several false starts over the years, the facility would create thousands of jobs. Another potential cash injection could come from the IMF and the World Bank. Dodoma has requested funds from both. The loans would be used to cap prices on everyday products. This, as many Tanzanians struggle to make ends meet.
So the problem is taxes. And why is Tanzania demanding the government to reduce the tax as soon as possible, as much as they can, so as to rescue the situation, because citizens and the entire Tanzania, we are in struggle. We are struggling the crisis. We are facing crisis, economic crisis.
Even without the oil price spikes linked to the war in Ukraine, Tanzania was already in dire straits. 1 in 10 Tanzanians live below the food poverty line, and a third of children are chronically malnourished.
Senegalese traders have been hit hard by tough economic sanctions that regional bloc ECOWAS imposed on Mali back in January. Our correspondents report from the border town of Kédougou.
The highway stretching between Dakar and the Malian capital, Bamako, is quieter than normal. Mali is facing economic sanctions following last year's coup d'etat. The impact has been disastrous for truckers like Mohamed, who now struggle to transport goods between the two countries.
We're tired of this embargo because it makes life difficult for us transporters.
Before we did 2 or 3 journeys to Mali every month. Today we do 1 at most.
Although food is not technically covered by the sanctions, increased border and customs checks have had a knock-on effect on prices in markets like this one in the border town of Kédougou.
Products are becoming more expensive. Meat that cost 3,000 CFA francs costs about 4,000 per kilo now.
The border impacts us a lot. That's why meat has become expensive. A cow that we could buy for 400,000 FCFA now costs more than 600,000.
An official at the local Chamber of Commerce told us that the situation is not tenable.
Mali is Senegal's first trading partner in this region. So we're worried about losses in revenue at a local level. But it also might lead to shortages, which would increase prices further.
ECOWAS is calling on Mali to hold elections ideally within a year. Until it does so, it's likely that the sanctions will remain and people will continue to feel the consequences in border towns like this one.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Stay with us, though. More news and headlines from around the world coming up. Take care.
They're known for